Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
The night I destroyed my own life, I was thinking about a door. Not the great iron doors at the far end of the Veltar Grand Hall, the ones that had been swung open that evening by 4 guards in formal black to admit the most powerful wolves on the continent. Not the door to the servants' corridor behind the north colonnade, the one I had been using for 4 years to slip in and out of gatherings like this, without attracting the kind of attention that costs a person something. Not even the door to my own small room in the staff wing, which I had left that morning in the ordinary way, lacing my apron behind my back and telling myself the night would be unremarkable, the way I told myself that every night. I was thinking about a door that no longer existed, a narrow wooden door in a building on the edge of a border settlement called Millhaven, 23 days' travel south of Veltar. A door I had last seen when I was 19 years old, standing in the rain with nothing but a canvas bag and the kind of numbness that sets in after the kind of fear that has no name and no clear end. That door had been the entrance to the modest healer's room, where a boy of 16 had lain for 3 days with river fever, the specific brutal kind that turned the skin the color of old wax and made the breathing shallow and wrong. That boy's name was Eli, and at the moment I was thinking about that door, Eli Vordain was standing in the center of the Veltar Grand Hall, with his wrists in chains. My name is Marin. I am 24 years old. I carry trays for a living, or I did, up until the moment everything ended, and something else began. The Veltar Grand Hall was the oldest building still standing in the northern reaches, a vast structure of dark stone and vaulted ceilings that had been hosting the conclave of Pax for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. The walls held tapestries in the colors of 12 Pax, heavy and faded with age, their edges fraying in ways that the household staff were not permitted to repair, because the fraying was considered historical. The fire pits ran the full length of both long walls, their light falling in uneven gold across the stone floor, and the assembled wolves who stood or sat or positioned themselves at careful angles around the room. The conclave met once every 4 years. Every alpha lord of the northern reaches was required to attend. Every dispute between territories that could not be settled by the Pax themselves was brought before the conclave for judgment. Every formal accusation, every treaty amendment, every act that carried sufficient political weight to require witnesses from all 12 territories was conducted in this hall, before this assembly, under the particular authority of the conclave law that had governed the northern Pax longer than any single ruling family. I had worked 4 conclaves. I had carried trays through rooms full of the most powerful wolves alive, and learned, over those 4 events, that the most useful thing a person in my position could cultivate was the specific skill of being present without being visible. You moved at the correct speed. You kept your eyes at the level of table surfaces and serving stations. You did not hold a gaze that found you by accident. You did not react to the things you heard while passing between conversations. The threats and bargains and carefully worded grievances that powerful people exchanged in voices just low enough to maintain the illusion of privacy while still being heard by anyone paying attention. I had been paying attention for 4 years. That was the thing no one in that room understood about the invisible ones, the servants, the staffers, the people whose names were not in any record that mattered. We heard everything. We saw everything. We understood the structure of power in that hall better than most of the people performing it, because we had spent years watching it from the angle that no one thinks to guard. The evening had begun without incident. I had been assigned to the eastern corridor of the hall, the section that ran alongside the high table where the Alpha King's party was seated. This was not a desirable assignment for most of the staff. The eastern corridor was the most scrutinized stretch of floor in the building. Any mistake made, there was made in front of everyone worth impressing, and everyone dangerous enough to matter. My supervisor, a compact, silver-haired woman named Dara, had given me the assignment without explanation 3 years running, and I had stopped asking why. The answer was the same one it always was. I did not spill. I did not react. I did not make the kind of small errors that nervous people make when they are aware of being watched. Dara valued precision over warmth, efficiency over presence, and had long since concluded that I was the safest pair of hands for the most exposed post in the room. She was not wrong. I carried the first round of wine without incident. I refilled the water pitchers along the eastern wall. I cleared the remains of the first course from the nearest tables and delivered the second, moving between the press of bodies and the arrangement of chairs with the particular economy of motion that comes from having done the same thing in the same room more times than a person can precisely count. The hall was full and loud in the way that such gatherings always were in their first hours. 12 territorial delegations, their advisors, their guards, their families in some cases, all of them performing the specific social labor of people who distrust each other on principle, but require each other for function. The noise was a layered thing. Laughter at some tables, low-voiced negotiation at others. The particular tense silence of the delegations that had arrived with unresolved grievances and were spending the evening performing patience they did not feel. I had served enough of these evenings to understand the layers, the ceremony on the surface, and the real work underneath it, the informal conversations held at the edges of the room, while the formal ones occupied the center, the specific geometry of who was standing close to whom, and what that proximity was meant to signal. It was, I had always thought, not entirely different from what I did with a tray. Moving through a space, reading what it required, making yourself useful without making yourself noticed. I noticed the Western delegation arriving late, not in the way that delegates sometimes arrived late as a deliberate display of status. This was different. They came in through the side entrance, a detail that was itself a kind of declaration, bypassing the formal greeting line entirely. There were 7 of them. The lead figure was a man I recognized from previous conclaves, a broad, pale-eyed alpha named Counselor Dressed, who represented the Ironwood Pack territories in the Western Highlands. Behind him came 2 advisors, 2 guards in formal ironwood silver, and a woman in a dark green traveling cloak who moved with the kind of careful posture that said she was angry and had decided to be controlled about it. Behind all of them, held at each arm by 2 of the guards, was a young man in plain clothes. He walked with his head down, his dark hair loose and somewhat disheveled, his hands bound together in front of him with a cord of braided pack-law rope, the distinctive rust and black weave that in conclave law designated a formal detainee. He was not fighting the hold. He was walking quietly, steadily, with the particular quality of someone who has accepted that resistance is no longer a useful calculation. I recognized him before I fully understood that I was recognizing him. It was the hands. He had a slight, unconscious habit of pressing his bound fingers together when he was frightened. I had seen him do it exactly once before, when he was 16 years old and burning with river fever in a healer's room in Millhaven, and the healer had told him there was a possibility he would not recover before morning. He had pressed his fingers together then as well. Just like that. Eli Vordain, youngest brother of Cairn Vordain, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. 20 years old now, which meant he had been 16 when I last saw him. He had grown considerably. He was tall in the way that young male wolves sometimes became in the years between adolescence and full maturity, all height and clean lines, not yet carrying the full physical presence of an adult alpha, still something in between. His face had sharpened from what I remembered. The faint softness that had been there at 16 was gone, replaced by angles that would eventually settle into something formidable, but had not quite finished the process yet. He looked, even now, even in chains and clearly frightened, like someone who had never once in his life intended to cause harm. I stopped walking. I was standing beside the second serving station on the eastern wall, a tray of filled wine cups balanced in my left hand, and I had stopped walking without deciding to stop. The hall had noticed the Western delegation's entrance. Conversations dropped in volume. Heads turned. The particular quality of attention in the room shifted, the way it does when something has entered that changes the nature of the gathering from performance to actual consequence. Counselor Drest moved directly toward the high table where the Alpha King was seated. Cairn Vordain was a man I had seen at every conclave I had worked. I had served him wine twice in the 3rd year, and cleared the table in front of him on at least 6 separate occasions. He had never once looked at me. This was not discourtesy. It was simply the natural consequence of the way power organizes a room. The people who hold it look at each other. Everyone else is furniture. He was watching the Western delegation cross the floor toward him, with an expression that told me nothing and everything simultaneously. That was one of the things you understood, working 4 conclaves, about Cairn Vordain. His face was controlled in the specific way that faces become controlled when the person behind them has spent years understanding that any visible reaction is information given to an adversary. He was watching Counselor Drest approach with the same quality of attention he applied to everything, steady and complete and entirely opaque. Beside him, to his left, sat the man I now recognized as Eli. No, that was wrong. Eli was in the center of the floor in chains. The young man to Cairn's left was someone else, an advisor perhaps, or a younger guard. I had confused myself in the first shock of recognition, placed Eli where I was accustomed to seeing younger members of the Vordain party. Counselor Drest reached the edge of the high table and stopped. He did not bow. In conclave law, a formal accusation suspended the usual hierarchy of greeting. If what Drest was here to present constituted a formal charge before the assembly, then the protocols of arrival were overridden by the protocols of judgment, and no bow was required. The absence of the bow was itself the announcement. Every wolf in that hall who understood conclave procedure, which was the majority of them, understood in that moment that this was not a late arrival for dinner. This was a charge. Drest's voice carried without apparent effort across the sudden quiet. Alpha King. He used the formal address without inflection, the clipped neutrality of someone delivering prepared language. The Ironwood Pack, presents a formal accusation before the conclave assembly, pursuant to Article 14 of the Compact of Shared Territories, which governs acts of violence against pack citizens committed by non-citizens on Ironwood-administered land. The silence was complete. Even the fire pits seemed to have absorbed sound rather than producing it. Cairn Vordain said nothing. His face said nothing. He waited with the patience of someone who understood that responding before the charge was fully stated was a tactical error, regardless of what you already knew or suspected or feared. 3 nights passed, on the border road between Millhaven Crossing and the Ironwood Southern Gate. Drest continued. Ironwood citizen Aldrich Fenn was killed. Witness testimony places the individual responsible at the scene. That individual is known to your household. A pause, measured and deliberate. We present Eli Vordain, youngest brother of the Alpha King, as the responsible party. The sound that moved through the hall was not a gasp. It was quieter than that, and more dangerous. The collective adjustment of 300 wolves processing information and beginning immediately to calculate its implications. I was still holding the wine tray. I had not moved. Eli, in the center of the floor, had raised his head at the sound of his name. His eyes had found his brother at the high table. Whatever I had expected to see in his face in that moment, defiance, perhaps, or fear, or even a desperate shaking of the head in denial, what I actually saw was neither of those things. He was looking at his brother with an expression that I recognized from a specific conversation in a small stone room in Millhaven 4 years ago. It was the expression of someone who has already accepted what is coming and is more concerned with the impact on the people watching than on themselves. Cairn Vordain spoke. What evidence does the Ironwood pack present? His voice was level, completely level. The kind of level that is not the absence of emotion, but the absolute mastery of it. Drest gestured to one of his advisors, who stepped forward with a folded document. 4 witness statements from Ironwood citizens present at the crossing. A 5th statement from a border guard. Physical evidence recovered at the scene consistent with Vordain pack markings. He paused again. Additionally, the accused has not denied the charge. This last part landed differently than everything that came before it. I looked at Eli. He was still looking at his brother. He was not, as far as I could see from where I stood, preparing to speak. He was simply standing there, with his hands bound, and his eyes on Cairn's face. And the silence he was offering in response to Drest's statement about his lack of denial was not the silence of guilt unchallenged. It was the silence of someone who has made a decision and is holding it. I did not understand yet what that decision was, but I understood what the charge meant. Under Article 14 of the Compact of Shared Territories, which I had heard cited at 2 previous conclaves in minor disputes, an act of violence resulting in the death of a pack citizen committed on pack-administered land by a non-citizen carried 3 possible responses. A negotiated blood debt, which required the accused's pack to offer substantial material reparation, a formal exile of the accused from all 12 territories, which was rarely imposed and never cleanly, or, if the Ironwood pack demanded it, a public execution before the conclave assembly, conducted according to old law. Aldrich Fenn, I would learn later, had been a captain of the Ironwood Guard. For the death of a guard captain, the Ironwood pack would almost certainly demand the 3rd option. Cairn Vordain was sitting in a chair at the high table of the Velthauer Grand Hall, before witnesses from all 12 territories, and his youngest brother was standing in the center of the floor in chains, and the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches was being asked in front of everyone to respond to a charge that carried the weight of everything: the alliance structure of 12 packs, the 30 years of hard-won peace between the Vordain throne and the Western territories, his brother's life. And he said nothing, not because he had no response. I had watched this man across 4 conclaves. The absence of speech was never the absence of thought. He was calculating. He was assessing every angle of an impossible set of choices in the time available, which was very little, because the entire conclave was watching, and the longer the silence extended, the more it would be read as weakness or complicity, or both. I watched his hands on the arm of the chair. His fingers pressed down once, very slightly, a motion so small that no one seated more than a few feet away would have noticed it. The kind of gesture a person makes when something inside them is reaching for certainty and finding only weight. I recognized it. Eli did the same thing with his fingers. Same motion, different scale. Something inherited, or learned young enough that it had become instinct. And in the time it took me to recognize that small, shared gesture between the 2 brothers, I understood something that I had not understood a moment before. Eli had not denied the charge, because a denial required an alternate explanation, and the alternate explanation was not one he was willing to offer. He was holding the silence, the way you hold something that will hurt the person you hand it to. He was protecting something with that silence, or someone, and Cairn was sitting in a chair, knowing that his brother was protecting something, and unable to ask, and unable to move without the information, and the entire weight of the northern packs was pressing down on that moment, like the ceiling of a very old building in a storm. I set the wine tray down on the serving station beside me. I set it down carefully, not because I was being careful, but because my hands were operating on their own, while the rest of me was somewhere else entirely, back in a small stone room in Millhaven, listening to a 16-year-old boy who was burning with fever tell a 19-year-old girl who had stopped to help that she should leave before someone who mattered noticed she was there, and that he was sorry he could not do more for her, and that she should keep moving, and that people like her deserved better than the road. He had been the first person in 2 years to speak to me, as though I was worth addressing directly. He had been 16 years old, and sick enough to die, and he had still thought to say it. I did not make the decision the way decisions are normally made. There was no moment of weighing, no calculation of consequence, no rational structure to it at all. There was the memory of that room and that voice and those words, and there was the sight of Eli standing in the center of the floor, with his hands bound and his eyes on his brother, and there was the knowledge that sat in me like cold stone, the knowledge of something no one else in that hall possessed. I knew why Eli was silent, and I knew that if he remained silent, there was only one direction this could go. I stepped forward from the serving station. I walked across the eastern corridor floor toward the center of the hall. I was still wearing my uniform, a gray dress, a white apron, the plain flat shoes of Velthar staff. I was carrying nothing. I had set the tray down. My hands were empty, and my face was calm, in the specific way that faces go calm. When the body has made a commitment, the mind is still processing. I stopped approximately 10 feet in front of Counselor Dressed, in a position that was clearly visible from the high table, from the Western delegation, and from the assembled conclave. The room, which had been watching Karen Vordan's face for a reaction, slowly became aware that something else was happening. I spoke into a silence so complete that my voice, which was not loud, carried to every corner of the hall. I would address the conclave. Counselor Drest turned to look at me with the specific quality of attention that powerful men give to unexpected variables, not yet dismissal, not yet recognition, simply the pause of something recalibrating. "That is not possible," he said, precisely but not unkindly. "This is a formal conclave proceeding. Address is restricted to territorial representatives, and those named in the charge." "Then name me in the charge," I said, "because the witness statements are wrong about who was responsible." The room was very quiet. Drest looked at me for a long moment. "You are staff," he said. "Yes. You have no standing before this assembly. I know. Then explain to me why I should entertain a single word you say." I held his gaze. "Because I was there," I said, "at the crossing, 3 nights past, and what your witnesses saw in the dark, from a distance, they interpreted incorrectly. The person who killed Aldrich Fenn was not Eli Vordain. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. I made myself breathe evenly and keep my hands still and my eyes on Drest's face, and not, under any circumstances, look toward the high table. "That person," I continued, and my voice was steady in the way that voices go steady when there is no more room for anything except the next word, "was me." The room they put me in was not a cell in the traditional sense of the word. It had a door that locked from the outside, and a narrow window set high in the stone wall that admitted a precise rectangle of night sky, and nothing else, and a wooden chair beside a low table on which someone had placed a single candle. These were the features of a room designed for temporary detention of individuals whose status was uncertain, not a punishment cell, not a proper holding space, but a kind of administrative pause, a room for people who had done something that required official consideration before anyone decided what to do about them. Dara, my supervisor, had been the one to walk me here. She had not spoken during the walk through the servants' corridors and down the back passage that connected the main hall to the administrative wing. She had her hands folded in front of her, and her expression arranged in the particular blankness of someone managing a situation by declining to engage with its emotional dimensions until a later time that might never arrive. I had worked under Dara for 4 years. I understood her silences. This one was not anger. It was the silence of someone holding a container that was very full and moving with extreme care to avoid spilling it. She had unlocked the door with a key from her belt, opened it, and waited for me to enter. At the threshold, she spoke. "I need you to understand," she said, in a voice pitched for just the 2 of us, "that I cannot protect you from this." I looked at her. "I know," I said. She held my gaze for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for information exchange, and shorter than it needed to be for everything else. Then she closed the door. I sat in the wooden chair. The candle had been burning when I arrived, which meant someone had anticipated the room would be used tonight, which meant that the Western delegation's arrival had not been entirely unexpected by the Veltar household, which meant that Karen Vordain had known, or suspected, that Counselor Drest was coming with a formal charge before the man had walked through the side entrance. I filed this information in the part of my mind that collected details that might eventually matter, and let it settle there with the rest. Outside the narrow window, The night was very dark and very still. I tried to reconstruct the expression on Eli Vordain's face when I had spoken my statement before the conclave. I had not looked at him directly. That had been deliberate. Looking at him would have told the room something about the nature of what I was claiming, would have given the assembled wolves something to read between us, a history or a connection or a reason, and reasons were the one thing I could not afford to offer. A reason could be challenged. A reason could be unpicked and examined and found inconsistent. The statement I had made in that hall had survived the first few minutes of scrutiny, precisely because I had offered it as a plain fact, with no architecture of explanation around it, just the clean, impossible claim, standing alone, daring anyone to know more than I did about what had happened on that road 3 nights ago. The door opened at what I estimated, from the position of the stars in the window, to be somewhere around the 2nd hour, past midnight. I did not look up immediately. In a situation like this, looking up immediately when a door opens is the gesture of a frightened person, and I had spent 4 years cultivating the appearance of someone who was not frightened, regardless of what was happening in my chest. I looked up in the time it would have taken me to look up if I had been a person with nothing to be afraid of. There was one guard in the doorway. Behind the guard stood Cairn Vordain. He was not in the formal attire he had been wearing in the hall. He had changed, or removed the outer layers, and was dressed in what I recognized as the kind of plain, dark clothing that senior members of high households sometimes wore when they moved through buildings at night, and preferred not to be immediately identifiable. His dark hair was down from the way he had worn it formerly, falling past his jaw. He looked, in the narrow light of the single candle, less like the Alpha King of the northern reaches, and more like a man who had not slept and had reached the specific hour of sleeplessness where the maintenance of composure becomes a purely mechanical exercise. He said something to the guard without turning around. I did not hear the words. The guard stepped back. The door remained open, but Cairn crossed the threshold, and the guard's footsteps retreated down the corridor. He stood in the center of the small room and looked at me. I did not stand. I remained in the chair, not as a deliberate slight. Sitting was simply what I was doing, and changing it would have required a reason. And the only reason available was that the Alpha King had entered the room, which was exactly the kind of reason I could not afford. He looked at me for a long time. There was nothing in his face that I could read clearly. I was accustomed to reading faces. It was, as I have said, one of the primary skills developed by 4 years of moving through rooms, where expression was currency. But Cairn Vordain's face was something I had understood, even before tonight, to be in a category of its own. The control was too complete and too practiced to yield ordinary information. What showed on his face was only what he permitted to show. And what he was permitting right now was a kind of attention that was not hostile, and not warm, and held no visible calculation in it, just presence, just the full weight of his consideration, directed at a girl in a gray dress, sitting in a wooden chair. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Who are you?" It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as the beginning of a different kind of accounting. "My name is Marin," I said. "I have been serving staff at Veltar House for 4 years. Before that, I worked a border posting, and before that, I was in Millhaven for approximately 8 months. Something shifted in his face when I said Millhaven. Barely visible, almost nothing. but it was there. "Why did you say what you said tonight?" he said. "I told the conclave what I know to be true." He crossed his arms and looked at me with the specific quality of attention given to statements that are technically accurate and functionally incomplete. "What you told the conclave," he said, "was that you were responsible for the death of an Ironwood guard captain on the southern border road. That statement, if maintained, will result in your formal arraignment under compact law, and, given the Ironwood Pact's demand for third option resolution, your public execution before the Assembly within the next 4 days." He paused. "You understand this?" "Yes," I said. "And you maintain the statement?" "Yes." The silence stretched. "Then you will explain to me," he said, "how a serving girl with no pack affiliation and no recorded history of conflict came to be on a restricted border road at the same time as my brother, in possession of the means and the capability to kill a trained Ironwood guard captain, and with a reason sufficient to justify doing so." I said nothing. He waited. The candlelight moved slightly with the air from the corridor. "You have no explanation," he said. "I have the statement I gave." He moved then, not toward me, but to the side, to the wall, and rested his shoulder against the stone in the manner of someone who has been standing for a long time and is making the smallest possible concession to that fact. He looked at me from this slightly different angle, with the same quality of attention. "He did not do it," Cairn said. He did not phrase this as a question either. "My brother." I did not answer. "Whatever happened on that road," he continued, "whatever the witnesses believed they saw, Eli was present, but not responsible. You know this, and you have made a statement to prevent the consequence from reaching him. That is what I am looking at." I held his gaze and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only position I had that could not be dismantled by the next question. "Tell me who was actually responsible," he said, "and I will pursue that line of evidence before the conclave. Your statement can be withdrawn. The arraignment process has a provision for revision within the first 24 hours of a formal charge." "I am not withdrawing the statement," I said. Something moved in his jaw, a controlled tightening. "You are choosing execution," he said, flatly, as a fact. "I am maintaining a statement I gave before the conclave. For my brother." The words arrived with a different weight than the ones before them. Not a question, not an accusation, something else. "You are choosing to die for a boy you presumably do not know." I looked at him. He looked at me. And then I said the only true thing I had said in the last 3 hours. That was not a lie. 3 nights ago, someone was standing at that crossing, I said, and something happened that should not have happened, and a man died, and a boy who did not cause it was going to be held responsible for it. I know what it means when a boy like that is held responsible for something he did not cause. I know what happens to the people who love him while they watch it happen. And I know what the rest of a life looks like when no one steps in. I paused. "Your brother remembered my name," I said. 4 years ago, when I was nobody, in a place that mattered to no one, he remembered my name, and he spoke to me like it was worth saying. I have not forgotten that. The room was very quiet. Cairn looked at me for a long time without speaking. The quality of his silence was different now from what it had been when he first entered. Something had shifted in it, not softened exactly, deepened. He uncrossed his arms. "I can offer you protection," he said finally. "Formal household protection. a position under the Crown's seal that would change the nature of the arraignment and allow for a more extended legal process during which alternate evidence could be introduced. It would not guarantee your freedom, but it would purchase time. No, I said. Material compensation, he said. Resources sufficient for relocation to outside compact territory. I can have a document drawn within the hour. No. Your release from this room, tonight, with an escort to the southern border. By the time the conclave reconvenes in the morning, you would be outside their jurisdiction. No, I said, and for the first time, there was something in my voice that was not just steadiness. What you are offering is a way to save me by abandoning what I said. I will not do that. He was watching me with an expression I had no precedent for on his face. You understand, he said carefully, that I cannot allow you to be executed for something you did not do. I looked at him. For the first time since he had entered the room, something shifted in my own composure. Not by much, but enough that I was aware of it. With respect, I said, that has never been the part of this that is your decision. He stood very still. The candle flame straightened in a brief absence of air movement and held. Then he turned and walked to the door. He paused at the threshold with his back to me for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of communication. Then he stepped into the corridor. I heard him stop. I heard him speak to someone in a voice too low to carry clearly, and I heard the guard's response, brief and affirmative. Then his footsteps moved away down the corridor. I sat in the chair in the small room and looked at the candle and made myself breathe in and out at a normal pace and told myself that what I had done tonight was not something a rational person would have done, and that this fact was irrelevant, because the moment I had set the wine tray on the serving station and walked to the center of the floor, rational had ceased to be the operative category. I had loved Millhaven. I had arrived there with nothing, and left with slightly more than nothing, and in between there had been 8 months of ordinary days, and one extraordinary one. And the extraordinary one had been the morning I found a sick boy in a borrowed room who was afraid he was going to die, and who had told me, even then, that I was worth more than the road I was walking. The way it had happened was ordinary enough. I had been cutting across the back passage of the boarding house, where I rented a narrow cot by the week, carrying a bucket to the courtyard pump, when I heard the particular kind of breathing that you learn to recognize if you have spent enough time in places where people do not always have access to healers, labored and too fast, and slightly wrong at the end of each exhale. The door it was coming from was ajar. I had pushed it open without deciding to, the way you act on certain sounds before your mind has assessed whether action is useful. He had been lying on the floor, not in the bed. On the floor beside it, which is a thing that happens with high fevers sometimes, when a person has been too hot and confused for too long, and finds the cold stone more bearable than the blankets. He was 16, though I did not know his age yet at that point, only that he was young and burning, and had the pale, wax-colored look that meant the fever had been going for at least a full day without treatment. I had brought water and the rough-grain bread from my own small provisions, and spent the next 3 days going back and forth, because the boarding-house healer was out of town, and the nearest one was a half-day's walk south, and I did not have the coin for that, and neither, it turned out, did he. He had introduced himself on the second day, when the worst of the fever had broken enough for conversation, as Eli. Just Eli. No family name, no pack name, no rank. I had understood this as either humility or caution, and had not pressed it either way, because where I was at that point in my life, I had my own reasons for keeping certain categories of information compact and private. He was not what I had expected from whatever I had briefly imagined, which had been somewhere in the territory of frightened boy, incapable of much beyond being frightened. He was thoughtful, in the specific way that people who read a great deal sometimes are, with a quality of attention that went sideways before it went forward, noticing the thing beside the obvious thing first. He asked me questions about the road I had come from, not in the manner of idle conversation, but with the kind of genuine interest that is instantly recognizable because it is instantly rare. He listened to the answers. On the third morning, when I told him I would be moving on that afternoon, he had sat up against the wall of the room, with a blanket around his shoulders, and looked at me with an expression that I had thought about many times in the 4 years since. "You stopped," he said, "for someone you did not know, in a place that was not yours. That is not something most people do." I told him that I had simply heard the sound and acted. He shook his head slightly. "You could have made a different choice at the door," he said. "You chose the one that cost you something. That is the part that matters." He paused. "I want you to know that it matters. People like you, who move toward things instead of away, deserve to know that it counts." He said my name then, Marin, which I had told him only once, on the first day, when he was half delirious with fever, and I had not expected him to retain it. He said it like it was a specific and particular word, like it was worth the space it occupied in a sentence. I had been walking for a long time by that point, and had not felt like a specific and particular person in quite a while, and the way he said my name, without ceremony or performance, just as a plain fact of address, had done something to me that I was not prepared for and did not know what to do with, and had carried quietly ever since. People who tell you that, at 16, with river fever still cooling from their skin, in a borrowed room in a border settlement, are not common. What I had done tonight was not for any political reason, or strategic calculation, or desire to alter the structure of the world. It was simply what you did for people like that, if you happened to be in the position to do it. I pressed my fingers together in my lap, and waited for morning. If you are still here with me, do not go anywhere. Subscribe right now, and turn on the bell so you do not miss what happens next. Because what happens in that courtroom will change everything, and you will not see it coming. The morning arrived through the narrow window as a pale angle of light across stone. I had not slept. This was not the kind of fear that moves through a body and rushes. It was something quieter and heavier, the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and understood fully that it cannot be unmade. What remained was simply the present moment and the willingness to move through what came next. The hall bell sounded 3 times at first light. In conclave schedule, this signaled the formal session, not the banquet gathering of the previous evening, the judgment chamber. The guard who came to walk me there was young and visibly uncomfortable in the way of someone assigned a task their training had not covered. He said nothing. I did not require conversation. I had never been in the judgment chamber before. Staff did not enter it. It was a smaller room adjoining the grand hall, with a raised council platform at one end and a stone floor below, where the parties to a proceeding were required to stand. A carved circle marked the formal standing position of the accused. The 12 conclave elders were already seated. At the end of the council row sat a woman of approximately 70 with white hair, and the bearing of someone for whom the weight of such rooms had long since stopped feeling like weight. I learned later her name was Merivin, the last surviving elder of the original compact negotiation, present for the annual signing and choosing to observe on the grounds that any proceedings touching Crown family members fell under her foundational jurisdiction. Along the left wall, the Ironwood delegation, Councillor Drest at their center, the woman in the green cloak at his right, the widow of Aldrich Fenn, her hands folded, her face composed with the particular effort of someone holding grief at a controlled distance. 2 advisors, 2 guards completing the row. Along the right wall, the Vorden Crown legal staff in formal white and black. A single space left empty at the end of the row. I walked to the marked circle and stood in it. The elder at the center of the platform spoke the formal opening in compact law, then switched to plain speech and read the charge. He looked at me. The accused will be given opportunity to address the assembly. Every eye in the room was on me. I opened my mouth. The side door opened. The person who walked through it was Eli Vordain. He was no longer in chains. He had been given clean, formal clothing, dark gray without pack insignia, and he had combed his hair, and his face carried the expression of someone who has spent a night completing a decision and has emerged from it into stillness. He was alone. No guard, no escort, no legal representative, and he walked to the center of the floor and stopped 3 feet to my left. Councillor Drest went rigid. The elder said with patient authority, "This proceeding concerns the accused currently standing before the assembly. Are you petitioning to address the council?" "Yes," Eli said. His voice was clear and steady. "The accused has the floor. You will wait your turn." "I will not," Eli said, and the courtesy in his tone removed the defiance from the words, without removing what they meant. "I am asking for immediate address on grounds that the statement given before the conclave last evening is materially false, and that I am the appropriate party to clarify the record." "You are Eli Vordain," the elder said. "Yes." "The individual named in the original charge." "Yes." "And you are claiming that the statement made by the current accused is false?" "I am. On the grounds that I was present at the crossing on the night in question, and I can tell you with certainty that the woman standing beside me had no part in what happened to Aldrich Fenn. The chamber went the way rooms go when the thing they were constructed to contain has become something different from what it was." Eli looked at me. For the first time since we had been in the same room together, he looked directly at me. I had not looked at him. I had kept my gaze on the council platform, because looking at him would have shown the room something I could not afford to show. But he looked at me, and in the moment before he turned back to the council, I saw what was in his face. He had known me from the moment I spoke in the grand hall. He had been standing in chains with his head down, and he had heard my voice, and he had known. He turned to the platform. "My prior silence was an error," he said, "one I should not have allowed to continue." Councillor Drest's expression shifted beneath its surface. "If you are claiming responsibility," the elder said carefully, "the charge transfers to you, and the petition for third option resolution remains active." "I understand," Eli said, "and I make this statement voluntarily and without duress." The room was very still. The elder looked at Dressed. Dressed looked at Eli. And the entire weight of the proceeding, which had been balanced on a single point since the previous evening, shifted. Then the main entrance of the chamber opened. Cairn Vordain walked in. Behind him, in formal Crown attendance, came 6 senior council members, his chief legal advisor, and the ambassador from the neutral Eastern Territories, whose position under compact law required impartiality in all formal proceedings. Every head in the room turned. Cairn walked to the front of the chamber and stopped. He did not stand in the marked circle. He stood beside it, approximately 2 feet to my right, facing the council platform, and the choice of where he placed himself in that room was a statement that required no words. Every wolf in the chamber could read its language. He had positioned himself beside the accused, not behind her, beside her. The formal position of witness for the defense, the position that said, in the spatial language of compact law, that every person in that hall had been raised to read without thinking, that the party in the marked circle was under the protection of the person standing next to them. Councillor Dressed was very still. The widow of Aldrich Fenn had folded her hands tighter and was looking at Cairn with an expression that contained, beneath its surface, the beginning of a different kind of grief. Not the sharp grief of an accusation, the slower kind, of a process that is not going to end the way you had hoped. Cairn's voice carried without effort to every corner of the chamber. This assembly is considering a petition for third option resolution under Article 14 of the Compact of Shared Territories. I am addressing the Council in my capacity as Alpha King under Article 26, which grants the Crown standing to offer testimony in any conclave proceeding bearing on Crown-affiliated individuals or Crown-associated actions. He paused. The individual standing in this circle acted in my family's interest, without being asked, without any expectation of survival. She offered a statement before this assembly that was inaccurate in order to protect my brother, because she believed protecting him was the correct thing to do. His gaze moved along the council row. Article 26 also grants the Crown the right to formally register an act of extraordinary service to the Northern Pax. I am registering that act now, in this chamber, before witnesses from all 12 territories. Councillor Dressed spoke. The Ironwood Pack does not consent to a Crown intervention in a formal conclave proceeding. The petition was filed in accordance with compact law. The Alpha King's personal sympathies are not a recognized basis for withdrawal. I am not invoking personal sympathy, Cairn said. I am invoking Article 26, which predates the third option petition process by 40 years, and was specifically written to prevent the conclave from processing charges against individuals acting in the Crown's service before the Crown has been given the opportunity to present its position. The elder at the center of the platform had the look of someone consulting an internal record very rapidly. That provision, he said slowly, has not been invoked in this chamber in 31 years. It has not been needed, Cairn said. It is needed now. The council conferred in low voices for approximately 90 seconds. The council will take a recess of 2 hours, the elder said finally, to review the Article 26 provision and its applicability. All parties will remain available for recall. He looked at me. The accused will be returned to the holding room pending determination. The guard at the door moved toward me. She will not be returned to the holding room, Cairn said. The voice was quiet and entirely certain. She will be taken to the guest quarters in the East Wing under Crown protection, and she will be given breakfast, and she will wait there until the council returns. The elder regarded Cairn with the expression of a man deciding that a wall had moved, and that argument with a wall was not productive. That falls within the Alpha King's authority under Article 26, he said, provided the accused remains available for recall. She will be available, Cairn said. I stood in the marked circle a moment longer, and did the internal accounting of someone whose situation has moved so far outside any category they prepared for, that the only available response is to simply accept it as the new landscape and keep moving. Then I looked up. Eli was 3 feet to my left, watching me with the same expression he had worn before addressing the council. The careful attention of someone who has a great deal to say and understands this is not yet the moment for it. I nodded at him. Once. He nodded back. That was enough for now. The East Wing guest quarters were, by any standard I had previously applied to the concept of a room, extraordinary. Wide windows facing the inner courtyard, actual furnishings, and a fire that had been lit recently enough that the room was genuinely warm. Breakfast arrived within 20 minutes. I was still in my uniform. I ate slowly and let the warmth from the grate work on the tension in my shoulders, and tried not to calculate what the council's recess would produce. The knock came after approximately 40 minutes. "Come in," I said. Cairn Vordain came in alone. He sat in the chair across the table from me. This was a thing I had not expected. He looked at me with an expression that was no longer the same careful opacity it had been the night before in the holding room. Something had shifted in it. I could not yet name what the shift was, but it was there. "The council will rule in your favor," he said. "The widow of Aldrich Fenn withdrew her support for the petition this morning, before the recess. I asked her last night to hear the full account of what happened on the border road. I spent 2 hours with her, and told her what my brother had been carrying, and the sequence of events as Eli described them. What happened was an accident. Eli was on that road because he had followed someone there who he believed was in danger. The confrontation that resulted was not planned by either party, and the death was not intended by anyone." He looked at the table between us briefly. "Mireia Fenn is not a woman who wants a false execution. She wanted someone to be accountable, and she deserved to know what actually happened. She withdrew the petition on the condition that the full account be entered into the conclave record, and that Eli make a formal acknowledgement before the assembly, without criminal consequence, under Crown protection. He will do that," I said. "He already agreed," Cairn said. "This morning." I sat with this. "And you," I said. "What do you want?" He looked at me. Not the way he had looked at me the night before. Something different. "I want to understand," he said, "how a woman I have never noticed, in 4 years of her being in the same building as me, becomes the only person in a hall of 300 wolves who moved." "They were calculating the cost," I said. "Yes." "I was not calculating the cost." "No," he said. He looked at me with the expression I still could not name. How does a person reach the place where they are not calculating the cost? "I think cost calculation requires believing you have something you cannot afford to lose," I said. "I have spent most of my life not having much. It leaves you freer than people who have more." Something in his expression shifted completely. It was not the expression of an Alpha King assessing a variable. It was simply the expression of a man hearing something that has landed in a specific place in the chest and stayed there. "My brother has been asking to see you since 4 this morning," he said. "I know. He says you told him a story about a stone tower and a girl who climbed it and found the view was nothing special, but the climbing had been worth it. I had forgotten the story. Hearing it described, I remembered inventing it at 2 in the morning to give a frightened boy something to follow that was not his fever. I made it up as I went," I said. "He has told it to other people," Cairn said. "He told it to me about 2 years ago. He said a woman told it to him when he was very sick, and he had never forgotten her. He did not know your name. He had called you Amber because of your hair in the candlelight." Something tightened in my throat. I pressed my fingers together and breathed through it. "The council will return in approximately an hour," he said. "The ruling will be in your favor. After that, you are free to leave, to return to your position here, or to consider other arrangements." A pause. "I would like to discuss other arrangements." "What kind?" I said. "A formal position within the Crown household, not a serving role. Something with standing, with resources, suited to someone with your particular skill, for reading rooms, and understanding what is actually happening in them." He paused again. "And a proper introduction to my brother, who would very much like to thank the woman he has remembered as Amber for 4 years. I sat with the fire warm on my face, and the sound of the courtyard coming through the tall windows. "I would like to meet him," I said, "and the position. I would like to hear more about it." He looked at me. Something that had been contained in the arrangement of his face through the entire conversation moved at last, in a direction that had no political architecture to it at all. Just a man, briefly, with the quiet that arrives when something complicated has resolved into something simple. "You will have time," he said. "We both will." He stood and moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused. It was the same pause as the night before in the corridor, the one that had lasted long enough to carry its own meaning. This time he turned. "In Millhaven," he said, "when you sat with him, you were 19. Yes, you were not staff. You were not anyone's servant. You were a girl on a road with a canvas bag. Yes, and you still stopped." "He looked like someone who needed the company," I said. Cairn looked at me for a long moment, and the expression that had been moving across his face in careful fractions all morning finally completed itself. Not grand, not ceremonial, just the expression of a man who has understood something about the world that he did not understand before, and who is still in the first moment of that understanding, while it is still simply arrival. He held my gaze for the length of one breath. Then he left. The door closed. Outside the tall windows, the courtyard lived its ordinary morning life. Guards on their routes, staff crossing with baskets and purposeful steps, the sound of the kitchen somewhere below, the specific quality of a large household returning to its own ordinary rhythms. I had arrived at Veltower 4 years ago with a canvas bag and the numbness of someone who had learned to carry difficulty by keeping it very quiet. I did not know yet exactly what I was leaving with. But the woman who had set a wine tray on a serving station and walked across a floor full of 300 wolves was not the woman who had stood in the corridor 4 years earlier, and the difference was not the result of calculation. It was the result of a door in Millhaven that no longer existed, and a boy who had thought to say a name like it was worth saying, and a night that had begun with the intention of being unremarkable, and had become, without any plan at all, the night that everything changed. The tower story had been right. The view from the top of a climb is never what matters. The climbing is the thing. It has always been the thing. It had always, every step of it, been entirely worth it. If this story held you all the way to the last word, then you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on every notification, because the next story begins exactly where you stopped breathing, and you will not want to miss a single word of it.